Greetings, good afternoon, and welcome to the Wilson Center. Thanks so much for being here, those of you joining us in person, and thank you to the very many of you who expressed interest and are joining us online today for this very special conversation. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I'm the director of our Latin America program here at the Wilson Center in Washington. We are thrilled by this special event. This is the first time that the executive secretary, as executive secretary of CEPAL, of ECLAC, has been on a trip to Washington in his official capacity. And we were delighted that he was willing to come to the Wilson Center to discuss his vision for the organization, his views of Latin America's economic development challenges, but importantly, its opportunities, and to spend some time with the experts that we have assembled here at the Wilson Center and with those of you following online to discuss pathways to prosperity for Latin America and the Caribbean. I want to take a moment to tell you about Jose Manuel, our good friend. Those of you in the room know him well and have followed him throughout his career. He was appointed by the UN Secretary General as the Executive Secretary of ECLAC in September of 2022. He's a well-known Costa Rican economist, a former regional director for the ILO, the International Labor Organization, holds a PhD in economics from Cambridge University, and previously served as the Minister of Foreign Trade for the government of Costa Rica. ECLAC, of course, is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. It was established in 1948 and has been and remains a leading source of data, objective analysis, and importantly, ideas for Latin America and the Caribbean, ideas that are arguably needed now more than ever, or at least more than in recent history. Before I give just a brief context for this conversation, I do want to welcome particularly two of our special guests. The ambassadors of Chile and Costa Rica have joined us today here at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for being here and for your partnerships with the center. Latin America, of course, is struggling right now to find new engines of sustainable development and growth. Though the recovery from the pandemic was arguably more robust and quicker than some had expected, the monetary policy was a model for the world. The ability of governments to reduce some of the excessive spending that was necessary during the pandemic has also been a notable and positive record for this region. But at the same time, the normalization of economic conditions have brought us back into clearer focus the structural challenges that the region has struggled with for more than a decade now. A decade where we've seen growth average less than 1%, an even lower on average per country growth than the region experienced in the notorious lost decade of the 1980s. Growth in Latin America averaged 4.1% in 2022, but likely fell last year to closer to 2% and will average approximately 2.3% in the near future, a rate that is far below the region's potential and far below what's necessary to generate the resources to meet increasingly high expectations from Latin American populations for the fights against inequality and poverty, to have resources for strong public services, from health and education and citizen security, and to guarantee a decent livelihood and life for the peoples of the Western Hemisphere. And so we're here to try to not diagnose necessarily all of the causes of that stagnation over the last 10 years, but to think about the next 10 years. We've entitled this conversation, No More Lost Decades, with the idea that with thinkers such as the Executive Secretary and his exceptional team at CEPAL, we might be able to find new engines of growth for Latin America that would enable a strong and sustainable recovery from the very difficult period that I have just described. Now, you'll hear in much greater detail from the Executive Secretary what some of those engines are, but I'll mention them in passing because they're areas we focus a great deal on here at the Wilson Center. They include opportunities for nearshoring, for large multinational companies to diversify their supply chains by establishing themselves or expanding their presence throughout the Americas. This includes in strategic industries such as microprocessors and medical devices, but goes well beyond and takes advantage of the extraordinary workforce in the region, its natural resources, and the industrial policy interests of many, if not all, of its governments. This includes a special role for Latin America in the global energy transition, based not only on, but including its extraordinary endowment of copper, of lithium, of rare earths, and other minerals that are essential for this transition, but also its desire to design and manufacture the technologies that depend upon these resources and that will serve as a critical part of the global response to the climate crisis. And it includes a long list, and you'll hear it shortly from Jose Manuel, of other new and traditional drivers of economic activity that are available in this region, from feeding the world, from energizing the world, and on and on. Let me stop there, and I will turn to our special guest for introductory remarks about how he sees the role of CEPAL in Latin America now under his leadership and these opportunities to avoid another lost decade. And then we will turn to all of the expertise that we have assembled in this room to have more of a free-flowing conversation with Jose Manuel. But again, thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for those of you following online. Most of all, thank you for your partnership from CEPAL and for your extraordinary leadership. We're so excited for this conversation and for future work that I'm certain we'll do together.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Benjamin. It's a great pleasure to be here again, as you said, for the first time in my new capacity as Executive Secretary of CEPAL, ECLAC. And thank you very much, ambassadors who are here, and everyone, and some friends and people I know very well. I'm here with three of the persons from the ECLAC team, Andres Valenciano, who is the director of our Washington office, Silvia Hernandez, who is the chief of staff, and Marco Ginás, who is the director of the Productive Development, Productivity, and Enterprise Development Division. So it's a great pleasure. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. So how do we look at the challenges of Latin America? That's what I'm going to address in 2 minutes. But before that, let me tell you, for maybe those who are not familiar with CEPAL, we are a think tank. We are one of 5 economic commissions that the United Nations has in each region of the world. There's one for Africa, one for the Arab countries, one from Asia Pacific, and one for Europe. We have 76 years this year of existence, and our mandate and our work is analysis and diagnosis of the situation, contribution for the economic and social challenges. We provide technical assistance to countries, but we have what we call intergovernmental bodies, which basically are meetings, some every year, some every 2 years. There is one which is every 3 years, of ministers of different subjects. We have the meeting of the ministers of science and technology, social policy. Actually, this week, when we just launched this week, the fiscal panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean, and we had the ministers of finance or vice ministers of finance. Actually, that meeting is finishing today. We have a platform for tax cooperation with 16 countries or more are joining to discuss the tax reform challenges in the region and also the international tax reform challenges. We have a meeting of South-South cooperation. We have the annual Forum for Sustainable Development, where which actually was only 1 month ago, where we review and present the progress or lack of progress on the road to the 2030 agenda and the goals and indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. We also have a number of other platforms. Very important conference, the one every 3 years, is the Conference of Women in Latin America and the Caribbean. Very powerful. The last one was in Buenos Aires in November 22. 1,500 leaders, plus previously a forum of women parliamentarians with more than 100 women parliamentarians, etc. So, and there's a whole vision about how to reduce, eliminate, hopefully, gender inequality in the region, but also how to build the care society, and with the figures and so on about, the care responsibilities. We now have 16 countries that have use of time surveys, and so we know how much is the care responsibility of women versus men, and believe me, it's very disproportionate, so there's a lot of work to be done there. So this is what ECLAC is. Now, how do we see the main challenges in the region? We see, to do a first approximation, a region in, which is in three development traps. The first trap is a low growth trap, and I think it's better to say a low capacity to grow trap, which is very worrying. One of the indicators of this very clear is that in the last decade, from 2014 to 2023, the average rate of growth was only 0.8%. Of course, with a lot of differences between countries, also differences along the 10 years, because there is volatility even for each country. But 0.8% on average is a disaster. It's a development disaster, it's an employment disaster, it's a poverty disaster. You can't really reduce poverty with those low rates of growth. Very difficult to reduce informality, very difficult to create good jobs. And also, with that rate of growth, the tax revenues are very low. Because we know that responds very quickly to higher rates of growth. So that means that the fiscal space is also constrained. There's other reasons to constrain fiscal space. And this is why this is quite disastrous, and this is why we're putting an enormous emphasis in our message, in our recommendations, and in our work for the need to do everything that needs to be done, it depends on the country, for increasing the rate of growth. Of course, not any type of growth. We know that is growth with certain characteristics, growth which is inclusive in terms of job creation, and growth which is sustainable. We have a whole new paradigm to look at growth, friendly with nature and with the planet, and with a number of other criteria for sustainability. So that's absolutely crucial, and that is, the first trap, and the main instrument that we recommend, and we're putting a lot of not just emphasis, but doing analysis and so on, is what we're calling productive development policies, which is a different version, and perhaps in the conversation we can talk a bit more about it. It's not industrial policies. It's similar to it, but they are more comprehensive because it includes industry, it includes services, it includes agriculture, so they have to be broadband. But clearly the message here is you have to work on the horizontal agenda of issues like tramitología, red tape, the investment climate, and all these things that traditionally have been emphasized, financing. But it is essential to work also on the vertical issues. And by vertical issues, I mean what we're calling dynamizing sectors that can be drivers of growth. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment. The second trap where we see Latin America caught, and this is very well known, unfortunately, and it's been repeated for decades and continues to be true, is that we are the most unequal region in the world. So high inequality, but it's not just high inequality. There are two other characteristics that it is important to mention that are intermixed with high inequality, but take you to a different place in terms of the policy responses. One is low social mobility. So high inequality, low social mobility, and low social cohesion. The social mobility component is crucial. It's part of inequality. But, I mean, if you want to have, like many Latin American countries used to have, high social mobility, which is like the children of, of today's parents can have a very high probability of having better jobs and better incomes than their parents and their grandparents. And that was happening. That happened in Latin America big time in past decades. Now these social mobility mechanisms are weakened. And they are weakened because of two main factors. If one wants to simplify this a bit. One is the non-dynamic labor markets, very sluggish labor markets, because with 0.8% growth you cannot have dynamic labor markets. And secondly, because of weaknesses, in some cases very sadly very bad weaknesses of education systems. Because education is crucial, and vocational training systems for people also to be able to get the better jobs that are being created, that need, of course, digital education, and that need a whole set of characteristics that only the students that finish at least secondary education and that having finished have good results can really achieve. And unfortunately, give you one figure, only 42% of the labor force on average in Latin America has finished secondary education. The dropout rates in secondary are very high. So this is not the kind of labor force that countries need in the 21st century. is disastrous as well. And even those that finish secondary education, the results of most Latin American countries in the PISA test of the OECD, mathematics, science, engineering, and so on, are quite low. So that's, a second kind of a strong weakness. So inequality, low social mobility, there's much more to say about that, what to do about it. And the third trap is weak governance and weak institutional capacity. So we're making this a central concern and central issue for our agenda. We're putting a new research agenda on governance of public policies and capabilities of institutions and spaces for social dialogue and the political economy reform. These are the four components. These are not just a coincidence of a way of speaking. This has four very well-defined issues around the issue of how to have more effective public policies. Governance is very broad. It includes the capacity of presidential systems to pass laws in parliaments, or when you have situations of standstill, of paralysis, and so on. That's not something we're going very deep into because other institutions are doing it, and it's a little bit beyond our mandate. But we're talking about the governance in terms of coordination failures. A lot of the new, when you talk about the transition, energy transition or creating jobs or almost anything because of the change, in technology and so on, you need, you have to get out of the old silos where the ministries, how the ministries divide the lines of competency. A lot of the new challenges need different ministries, different agencies to work together, and not the traditional divisions, including the education system, including vocational training system that have to, relevant for everything. So the governance of the different policy areas. The big question is here that Latin America needs great transformations. In fact, we are talking about 11 great transformations. I will tell you in a moment what they are. This is elaborating more on these three traps kind of framework. And then for how do you manage successfully those transformations? This is really the big question. I mean, you can have wonderful plans. I think there's no country in Latin America that doesn't have a digital transformation plan, but go and see in reality. What's on paper is one thing, what's happening in reality is very different. So, I mean, there's obviously a big gap, a big problem there of execution, of implementation, of being able to actually move the needles in the area of competence. So this is a governance issue. Secondly, is an issue of what we're calling the TOPP, the top capabilities of institution. And by top, we mean technical, operational, political, and prospective, all capacities for foresight of institutions. And then we are elaborating what each one of these means and applying this framework, to analysis of specific policy areas. The political capacities are very important. I mean, you can have even a very good minister or, man or woman or a top-level team in a ministry, but if the ministry doesn't have the means, the finance, the technocracy, if you like, in the good sense, the expertise, the technical capacities or the planning and everything, then you don't go very far. The political capacities are the capacities to convene the stakeholders, the capacities to build a coalition for reform that is stronger than the coalition for resistance of the reform and the opposition. And that's the world of politics. But what we're saying at ECLAC, now is, look, we have to systematically look at this because we're quite advanced. I mean, most Latin American countries have diagnosis, very good diagnosis, from all sorts of institutions, the World Bank, IDB, the CAF, the other UN agencies, and their own diagnosis, and even wonderful plans. But, again, the problem is how do you move? So we have to systematically analyze the obstacles to manage those transformations. And there is knowledge. This is a type of knowledge which is a little bit different from the type of knowledge that you need to analyze economic system, social system, ecological system, because it's a knowledge about how to do the transformations. It's about collective action. Why is collective action not working in particular situations? I think that is a trap. Then, so these are the three traps. A longer version of that is this graph that I frequently show that has two versions. a diagnostic mode, and if you do one click, you have a prescriptive mode. The diagnostic mode identifies a decalogue, 10 areas of major development challenges in Latin America. One is precisely the low capacity to grow, and the need to have rapid, sustainable, and inclusive growth. Then you have a number of social challenges, like the inequality, social mobility, the whole discussion about the welfare states and the expansion of social protection. Of course, many countries have managed to build very good social protection systems, but there are still very strong gaps in many places about coverage. And even when there is coverage, the pension is insufficient. So it's a poverty pension. So how do you do that? And now, particularly with the demographic change, where poses a huge challenge to all the pension systems. The whole issue of effective education for all and vocational training systems, and the whole issue of gender disparities, where we can talk more, is a big topic, and all the issues of migration, where, again, a huge topic where we are working as well. So all this is kind of constitute this kind of social group of challenges. Then we have, of course, the environmental potential, and also the environmental challenges in terms of pollution, etc., but everything that is going on. And then trade and regional integration, and finally, the fiscal frameworks and the macroeconomics. So this is what we call the decalogue, the 10 areas. And this is why we talk about 11 great transformations. All these areas need great transformations. And the number one, 10+1, is the transversal one of the capacities, institutional capacities and governance. So we talk about, so this is our vision. And finally, to finish this initial kind of intervention, one of our proposals for dynamizing growth is we have a portfolio of driving sectors or dynamizing sectors. We have a list of 14. I'm going to mention some of them, but with a warning. It's not that we're saying all the countries have to do this. This is the list, the magic list. There's no magic list. But certainly all these sectors, for different reasons, are extremely important. They have enormous potential to dynamize growth, create employment, etc. And they include, and this is why we're not talking just about industrial policy. We're not talking about industrial policy. That's a deep topic for a number of reasons, but at least two. One is that in contrast to the classic days of development economics and of ECLAC in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, the apuesta, the bet was on industrialization. It was industrialization strategies, because the classical economists, including Raúl Prebisch and many others, Myrdal and Jonas a list, they were right. At that time, industry had at least 4 characteristics that were unique to industry: economies of scale, tradability, forward and backward linkages, and knowledge spillovers, and demand for high quality, and therefore all that combined, high productivity and then high incomes. So of course that was the road to upgrade and to do virtuous structural transformation. But now, with the change in the world, and particularly the technological revolution, when you talk about Industry 4.0, is also modern services, and is also modern agriculture, which now uses drones and precision agriculture and everything. And frankly, I mean, if you apply this criteria about economies of scale, forward linkages, high skills, and tradability, modern services do all that and even more than industry. Modern services, in fact, they have too many economies of scale. That's where you have giants in the technological, which, I mean, the challenge is how do you competition policy, because they become, economies of scale so big that they continue growing and dominating the whole market. So we very much focus on the need for Latin America to bet on these modern sectors based on the digital revolution. And also in classical industrial sectors, but very important, the pharmaceutical industry, the life sciences industry. There's a whole revolution there, of course, like everywhere. The medical devices industry. There are several countries, including mine, Costa Rica, including the Dominican Republic. Of course, Mexico in Tijuana has the biggest cluster of medical devices in the region. Costa Rica is the second one. And then in terms of the green sectors, what we call the big push of sustainability, energy transition, renewable energies, green hydrogen, lithium, and all this energy transition, not just to decarbonize our own economies, but because we have these huge reserves, several countries in Latin America, of strategic minerals, which are at the center of the electrical mobility revolution, you know, with all the batteries and the cars and buses. And this is only starting. I mean, there are thousands of buses just in the city of Sao Paulo. And also in other cities, you know, San Jose, which is, you know, a small neighborhood of Sao Paulo, the capital of Costa Rica, has you know, 4,000 buses. So, I mean, imagine the opportunity for that change in electrical mobility of, you know, having all these electrical buses. Well, the only country that builds electrical buses now, full, is China. So, you know, there's 2 companies in Chile, and we are already putting them in contact. There was a mission to Barbados, to Costa Rica, to Colombia, that have developed a technology which is not rocket science to take an old bus, diesel bus, and do retrofitting and so on, and turn it into an electric bus. And that bus, which has a very good lifetime and so on, even though it's used, but it's new in being electric, costs 60% of what a new Chinese electric bus. So, I mean, this is just to mention one business opportunity. This is enormous. And then we have circular economy, we have biotechnology, sustainable agriculture, all the genetic resources and bioindustrialization, agriculture for food security, sustainable tourism, just to mention a few. And finally, which is kind of transversal, the whole issue of nearshoring and reshoring. This is a massive reaccommodation of, if you like, the geography of production. A lot of production is coming because of the technological rivalries or oil rivalries between, you know, countries and economic blocs. So, you know, there are 3 big factories in the world, if you want to put it, you know, the factory in Asia, the factory in Europe, and the factory in the United States and Canada and Mexico. So this is the kind of also geopolitics and geoeconomics and trends that Latin American countries have to understand very well to be able to position themselves to take advantage of this nearshoring, reshoring, and the investment attraction, which also requires a lot of domestic efforts in investment climate and in training of the labor force. So, you know, for, I don't know if it was 10 minutes, but this is the vision that we are kind of promoting, and there is ECLAC review that has all the story in more details, covering every single aspect of what I have said now, but in some, I don't want to raise a false expectation, in some areas like the institutional capability, we're raising the questions, but we are really just beginning kind of a massive, well, ambitious, let's not say massive, research agenda on that. Thank you very much.
Exceptionally helpful. We will make sure to have links on our event website to these publications so that everyone who has just seen them referenced will be able to find them and download them shortly after our conversation. I know I promised that we would stay optimistic, and we will, and I'm going to turn in just a moment to our in-person participants here to dive into these so-called driving sectors that you've identified. But I do want to just have you address quickly, if you would, a few of the new challenges that even these sectors will face that we haven't quite talked about. I think we talked about some of the traditional structural challenges in the region, but maybe the climate shocks as an area that is a more new but a very serious challenge in many parts of the region. Some of the problems with social unrest that I referenced earlier that result from these unmet expectations and potentially some of the fiscal constraints that you talked about, but also the impact on politics. And so this pendular politics that we increasingly see in the region, making it very difficult for the kinds of planning that you would need to have an industrial policy or a modern industrial policy succeed over time. And then the last one about security, but not the traditional insecurity at the street level, but organized crime. And the impacts that it's having in a lot of places, and that challenge some of the kinds of governance improvements that I think you're seeking when you look at one of your 3 development traps. If you could speak kind of briefly about those structural challenges, and in the meantime, I'd ask everyone in the room to consider your interventions. We'll turn to you next.
Yes. Okay, on climate shocks, I think we all know how climate has actually already changed, and we are actually very close to get the 1.5, which, you know, for years has been said by the IPCC that was critical and that was a kind of point of no return, or anyway very serious. So that's why all these efforts of mitigation continue to be absolutely essential. But the fact is that we are receiving enormous climate shocks. I mean, you see in terms of the average temperatures, heat waves, floods, hurricanes. I mean, many of these natural disasters have really increased. The statistics are very clear. I mean, there's no discussion about it. And they are very costly. They are very costly for the destruction that they do. They destroy infrastructure. They destroy crops. They require to move people, resettle, not just for the emergency, but sometimes permanently and so on. So they require investments. And this is in a region and in countries that have, limited fiscal space, that are, the whole cost. Now we are in an era of higher interest rates. They're still high, and they're going to remain relatively high, even though they come down a little bit in some countries, which also is a burden on the fiscal space because of the weight of the interest payments only, that we've estimated, depending on the country, which is 3, 4, or even 5 points of GDP in interest payments. So, but the point on climate shocks is that we're receiving it, that we need investments in adaptation. And it all indicates, science indicates that this will only get worse, even if the world is successful in reducing, or at least putting a ceiling on the 1.5, which we will see. So that is a massive challenge. Social unrest. Well, look, I mean, it's not really surprising that in a region that grows at 0.8% or average, that has high inequality, low social mobility, and issues of social cohesion and segmentation, in educational systems, health systems, and where you have private and you have public and all this, that the population is frustrated because they feel that democracies are not delivering what democracy should deliver. I mean, that to say it in an abstract way, but in concrete terms, there's millions of people that feel that they really have the short end of the stick, and at the same time they see, consumption levels which are very luxurious, and they see them on the street, in television, in social networks. So all that produces anger, and all that made worse by polarization. And then polarization takes us into a whole world of politics, and a certain style of leadership, a certain style of, electoral campaigns, which exacerbates because it's all based on accusations, on, everything that everybody doesn't agree with me is against me, and, I'm putting it very diplomatically, but you know what I'm referring about to, and this is difficult. So if you have objective situations economically that are root causes of this, and you have a political system and political styles, and candidates that, to get there, when they become president, have this style, then there is, it's a time bomb. And what we're saying is that, well, the politics is the politics. That has different things. I'm going to go into that. That's not ECLAC's issue, but at least on the economic side, on the inequalities and growth, there's a lot that can be done, that should be done. Democracies have to deliver, because if they don't deliver, there's a lot of risk. I mean, we're going to have continued, anger, more inequality, more millions of people migrating. By the way, this is, I said in the yesterday in the event, in the panel, the Council of the Americas, that, talking about root causes, for me, root cause number one is the 0.8% average growth in the last 10 years. I mean, how are you not going to have millions of people wanting to live with if you don't have opportunities with that very low rate of growth? So, I mean, there are many other things, of course, related to this. And there are other causes, which is the other topic, organized crime, that I'm going to refer in a moment. Impact on politics. Okay, I think I already covered the impact on politics. Unfortunately, the politics has become very divisive, very polarized. I really strongly recommend you to read the latest Human Development Report of UNDP, not just because it has interesting, kind of latest update of the Human Development Index in the world and in Latin America and so on, and you see the damage to the Human Development Index done by the pandemic and the cascade of crises, but it has a couple of chapters on polarization and what to do about that. And as they say in that report, polarization, actually, / populism poisons everything it touches, and that's what it said in that report, and I think that's powerful. Now, finally, so I think, and this is a problem because also what you mentioned, development is a cumulative process. You don't get development in one government in 4 years. I mean, you need políticas de Estado, just long term. And this is why we're emphasizing the issue of prospective foresight. I mean, you have to have institutions and governments that continue. You can't have governments that say just, paralyze what the previous government was doing because I don't like it. They do something else. And the way to have this continuity, apart from the wisdom of political leaders, is high-quality institutions. Institutions that have technical, operational, political, and prospective capabilities that are able to really give continuity, 10, 20 years. I mean, if you look at the successful Asian countries or European countries, I mean, you find this. You can have some tweaking of policies from one government to another, but then you have long-term plans that continue to be supported. Organized crime, again, this is not an area that we might begin to work more on this in ECLAC, but we are very worried about it, and we have been having several conversations because this has become so serious that you can see it as a new structural gap. If you make this list of 10 now, you have to put, citizen and security and organized crime. It affects the investment climate. Well, it affects people. It affects young people, having all these recruits and organized crime. It's an extremely difficult phenomenon. It's new. It's not just traditional violence, but because it's organized and it's crime and it's internationalized. So it has ways of penetrating different powers, everything, with corruption, judiciary, the different ministries, the private sector, all sectors, communities. I mean, they're in cities, in Latin American areas, you have organized crime. So there are territories where the state is not present, and they can do a lot of money there, and also win goodwill of the population because they feel that they're better off with some of these illicit activities. So this is an immensely difficult problem. UNDP has done some work on this, but I think, we think this is really something where there should be an international effort. It has all sorts of dimensions because it is very serious. And the question really is, how do you combat it within a democracy? Because, I mean, there's been talk of some models in some countries that have been very successful in combating organized crime, but with very hard lines, imprison a lot of people and so on. But the model is not just a lot of prisons and risk of human rights and all that discussion, which is a very important discussion. But that model, it requires other things. A well-functioning democracy probably cannot do those things so effectively. So the question is, how do you effective fight of organized crime and violence while respecting democratic governance rules?
Questions and observations? Please just introduce yourself and go right ahead.
Buenas tardes, Secretario. Eric Marquez with the Mexico Institute, Research Assistant. In the coming weeks, we are going to be coming out with a publication on how the U.S. and Mexican foreign aid agencies can collaborate further to address irregular migration coming out of northern Central America, specifically El Salvador, Honduras, y Guatemala. My question is, what are the areas, I know you mentioned employment training and youth in employment. What are the sectors that you think USAID and Amexid and other foreign aid agencies can have the biggest impact to address, irregular migration and the low workforce? Thank you.
And I guess I would just add, if you were watching the recent meetings in Guatemala and the visit of Secretary Blinken, there was obviously a great deal of discussion of the Los Angeles Agreement. So if you have any thoughts on how that's been implemented and the commitments that you heard just in the last few days from governments in the region, that'd be helpful as well.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, look, the migration panorama has been changing tremendously in recent years. We monitor, we have statistics, we follow, we have CELADE, the population division, and we work very closely with IOM Migration and with ACNUR, the Organization for Refugees and other UN agencies of this. Because, before we used to have kind of a simple model of countries of origin and countries of destination. Now many countries are origin and destination because, some people leave, but they also, receive Venezuelans. We estimate the numbers is like there's 6 million Venezuelans out of Venezuela in the last 5-6 years. That's huge as a migration flow. And you have more nationalities, and you have countries which are transit countries as well. There's a huge transit of, as we know, in Central America and Panama and the Darien Gap, with all the disaster that is that in terms of suffering and deaths for people and so on, and tremendous risks. So, migration. I mean, you have two big challenges. One is, how do you manage this situation? Because this situation is there, and to solve the root causes will take years. I mean, it's not easy to solve a root cause in a few months. I mean, that's not going to happen. So that means that for a number of years, we going to have to live with these flows, and we will have to manage them. So this is where we have the idea, that has been agreed internationally, of safe, orderly, and regular migration. It implies a lot of things. To be safe means, there's a humanitarian dimension to make sure that these are people. These are people that, in many cases, are left their country not because they wanted it. They're desperate. They're desperate because of lack of a good job, or another root cause because of organized crime. They know that if they stay, the young people are going to be recruited and going to end up dead and doing terrible things, which are irreversible in life. So that's one dimension, and there's a lot of work. The UN agencies with governments, and I think these meetings are taking place and so on, is very important to do that. And then also having the whole dimension of how do you get insert these migrants into the labor markets of the different countries. And it could be into the labor markets of Latin American countries, not just the United States. I mean, my country, Costa Rica, officially we have 500,000 to 600,000 Nicaraguans in a country of 5 million people. I mean, this is 10-12% of the population in the last 15 years. It has been absorbed. If you do these numbers for a country like Chile, it's just incredible, the amount of people. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody should do that, but what I'm saying is it is possible to have occupations, to have, to integrate some of these people, and they do good, and they add to society, and they feel grateful, and they do not necessarily become, gangs or the criminals or the worst of that society. And that is part of the challenge. And how to integrate is a whole process. You can filter, because, I mean, there's part of those migration flows. And again, organized crime uses the phenomenon of migration to infiltrate. And there's no doubt that there are some very bad apples coming with the good ones, right, who are the majority. So there is that. And then there's the issue of root causes. On root causes, just a thought. Look, and ECLAC in the past, there was a program called the Integrated Development Framework for Migrants to solve the root causes in the three countries, in the northern triangle of Central America. If you look at the diagnosis, I mean, in ECLAC's document, there were like 16 causes, root causes, everything. You think of anything, everything was there. It was a very interesting reading. It was very complete, Now, the problem is, if you try to turn this diagnosis into an integrated development program, it is everything. It's all development. I mean, this means developing completely the country. So I think root causes is important, but the solutions and the priorities have to be less ambitious than having everything, and mitigate and address the key root causes in each country. And the root causes are not the same. This is country by country. In some countries, the root cause is organized crime, the political situation, the political system, and that's why people are escaping. In other countries, is poverty, lack of opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in terms of, the root causes prioritization, it has to be country by country, even region or territory by territory. In some countries, there are some territories that are expulsing people, other territories are not. And I think it's very good that these meetings, like the one that Mr. Blinken, participate, are taking place. What I see now is that there are a lot of, collaboration and dialogue between countries. This is essential. And finally, there's, these migration flows have, I think this is well known, a challenge of governance. Because, you know, if you have a security approach, then you say it's the police that is going to solve this. But if you're going to integrate some of them, you have to talk with the Ministry of Labor and agencies, you know, how do you integrate these people and so on. So each country has to, and the international dialogue, improve on the governance and the coordination to be able to manage if you like, all the value chain, if you want to put it in those terms, or the chain, let's forget the value, the chain of migration in different stages.
I saw several questions here. Let's start with three of them that I saw first here, and then also Nicolas, and then we'll go to the next two.
Hi, thank you. I'm Virginia Queijo from the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you very much for your comments and your presentation. One thing you didn't talk that much, and I think I would be interested to know more, is about what is your division about integration. And in particular, for instance, you were talking about these vertical sectors, and I was thinking, well, is there an opportunity there for integration and going together on this, developing some specific hubs and integrate these sectors across countries also in different value chains? And so a little bit more on that would be interesting. And what are the possibilities? We know the challenges pretty much, and you talk about lost decade. In some of these countries has been lost decades on integration, and but it's a huge potential. And what is your view on that? Thank you.
Nicolas?
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One has to do with the end of the demographic dividend in the region and the aging population. And how do you conceptualize mobilizing that population? We have Uruguay is a really good example. It's a country whose population is actually going to start to decline over the next 5 years. And the government just passed a pension reform that will allow individuals to keep on working after they retire. So I'm wondering if this is a major plank of your framework, how to conceptualize mobilizing older workers without at the same time sacrificing their rights to their pensions. Is that something to think about? At the same time, we don't want to do the Argentina route where you give people pensions without financing, huge unfunded liabilities, which is a bigger disaster. So you really have to think about how you're financing these pensions. So I'm wondering if you've thought about this, the trade-offs there. The second thing I want to ask you about has to do with the state, the role of the state. As you know, Javier Milei is one on a free market agenda, and apparently it's quite popular. And I think there's a question there, which is that the state is increasingly seen as not providing the answer for everything, nor should it. So the question should be, how do you prioritize what the state should do and what the private sector should do? Because if the solution to the problem is always raising taxes, it's going to lose popularity. You have to prioritize. So I'm wondering if you guys have thought about efficiencies in the state, what the future state should prioritize, and what sectors and ministries should be the ones that the government should invest most its resources in. Thank you.
Those were two, so that's technically three, but I'm going to have one more. Jim, and then Cindy, you're in the next round. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Jim from Johns Hopkins SAIS. So mine, really, I'll make it quick. It's just really about corruption, especially public corruption. You know, perception corruption index shows an increase in corruption perception in Latin America. And so I was looking more, as you were talking about, institutional capacities. In a lot of countries, people have to pay for government services. To be able to receive government services, which they should be receiving for free. So I just want to know if you could expand a little more on your perspectives, but more on also what ECLAC is doing in terms of studying, researching, and providing recommendations for corruption. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So on economic integration, I mean, actually I think two questions, but I mean, on economic integration, look, there are several things there. You know, this is a classic topic in Latin America, very close to the hearts. There's a dream, you know. Every Latin American you know, there's no Latin American that get excited when you hear somebody saying, we should really get more economic integration, you know, we are all brothers, sisters, etc. So you find this in most declarations. There's almost no declaration of heads of state that has some nice, inspiring paragraph on economic integration. And there have been many attempts, and as we know, well, the different histories. I would say probably the scheme of economic integration that has survived better the shocks and the political changes and so on in Central America. Central American common market is working pretty well, despite you have very diverse regimes there. But no regime has really touched that. Everybody lives it quiet, partly because the private sector is extremely interested. A lot of the dynamism depends on that. You know, on average, the 24% depends on the year of the exports of each Latin American countries go to the other Latin American countries. And behind those exports, there's a lot of SMEs and so on, because it used to be some of the traditional import substitution industries and so on, you know, the food industry, clothing industry, shoes, this, that, a lot of things. And there are some institutions for economic integration. And finally, you know, Central Americans accepted that it's not a political integration. There were moments in which, oh, the federation, you know, and the political integration, and said, well, let's just economic, let's be pragmatic, let's do that. There's also energy interconnection that works very well, the Inter-American Highway. There are other things that, of course, there are many things one can say are not, you know, still need to be done. To give, you know, also, I mean, credit to the fact is that this is a small distance. I mean, you from San Jose, Costa Rica to Guatemala, you have, I don't think I'm mistaken by too many, but it's like 1,200, 300 kilometers. I mean, if you take from Santiago 1,300 kilometers to the south, you are not even in the middle of Chile. Chile is like 5,000 kilometers long. So, I mean, the integration for South America is a totally different proposition than the integration for Central America, because of the sheer size, continental size of the country. I mean, think of Brazil, think of Argentina, you know, and not just because of that, but because of the kind of nature you have. I mean, building a road in the Amazon is one thing, no? And crossing the Andes and the Cordillera is, so the obstacles, so distance, obstacles, and so on. And then you cannot have integration unless you have physical connectivity. I mean, except if it is integration on the new type, very recent, which is electronic commerce and all the services and all these things that you don't need that kind of, I mean, you need optical fiber, not a highway. But the point is here, I think, you know, in a way, to do integration well, the agenda of economic integration is very hard, and in a way it's boring. Because why do I say it's boring? Because it's just projects, it's infrastructure, it is rules of origin, it is customs, it's interoperability. And unless the government's really, and the commitment is very serious, and you put the teams to really negotiate this thing very, very hard, and payment systems and so on, you know, then you're not going to create the conditions so the private sector takes all the opportunities. And I think there has been a deficit of political will to really work on the boring agenda, if you like, of economic integration. That's one aspect. Mind you, I know the IDB works, and congrats, on a lot of the, you know, trade facilitation agenda with, you know, I know that the IDB has very good financing of improving the customs passes, and has improved tremendously in Central America and other places. All this trade facilitation agenda, well, that's part of the boring agenda, but it's very important, and congratulations that the IDB supports that so much. You know, much more of that has to happen to have good economic integration. And then there is the new agenda of integration, which is the new kind of digital, you know, and trading services. That is really new, and that did regulatory convergence, cybersecurity, safe payment systems, you know, electronic commerce. I mean, and that is not being, you know, that it needs to be systematic dealing with that part of the agenda. Now, for the hubs, yeah, I think there's a lot of transborder issues, particularly in certain areas. There's already projects, and I think the IDB, the World Bank, involved in all the Amazon. There are 8 Amazon, you know, countries that have, of course, Brazil big time, but also Colombia, also Peru, also 8 countries that have big parts of the Amazon, and that's a big hub to work on transborder issues where common projects, but there are all smaller ones, and that is crucial. Now, the other question was the demographic dividend. Yes, I mean, populations are aging very fast. This is creating all sorts of challenges and changing. For instance, in terms of the gender inequality and the challenge of building redes de cuido, how do you say that, care frameworks, you know, infrastructure for caring for children. Well, you know, now we have, and the countries are, you know, do not have much coverage of caring facilities to allow women to enter the labor market. The average participation rate difference between men and, you know, participation rate of men is 75%, of women is like 50%. It's like 51, 52, 24, 25 points of difference. That is huge, even though there has been progress. So there's a lot to be done there. But in 2028, 29, 30, country after country in Latin America, they are coming to the turning points where the demand for caring of the elderly are bigger than the demand for caring for young children because of low fertility rates and aging. Now, there's a very different challenge. Caring for the elderly, particularly if they are really elderly, it depends, you know, now it's a new, but, you know, caring after 75, caring after 80 or 85, it requires doctors, nurses, facilities of different types, and so huge investments. Now, if the countries do the necessary investments, this is going to be one of the most dynamic clusters of job creation because the need is enormous. The same happened in Europe. You know, in 2010-11, the European Commission did a study, and they concluded that there were 3 groups of occupations that would create the major amount of jobs in Europe, and one of them was precisely the care economy. So that's one that we're emphasizing a lot. It's very important. And then the other challenge that you mentioned, Nicolas, right, yeah, is the pension reform. I mean, so the financial stress is already being felt. Many countries, as you know, have that as a major priority in the agenda, like Chile, you know, and others. Because, you know, the demands, as I said, the gaps in coverage, or many people who are receiving pension, the pension is not enough. There is the whole discussion of the public-private balance. I mean, in Chile, there was a period in which, you know, Chile was kind of the leader in investing, you know, public, private funds and so on. Had to wait 30 years to see how it happened, and then the 30 years you had a financial crisis, and the returns on the investments and the portfolios were not as expected, and there were some injustices because what the pension, you know, the AFPs, you know, the pension would charge and earn, you know, was independent of the return. So all the adjustment of the low returns or lower than expected returns was on the savers who had the money there, etc. So you have big debate. But one of the conclusions is that, yes, this could be a good complement, but you cannot just rely on private systems. You have to have sistema de reparto and sharing, and that is a huge challenge. So, you know, many countries have this, and different ways of putting the pillars and so on. So there's no doubt that, you know, that certainly demographic change is slow, but it's very clear, very predictable. It's going to happen. And of course, you don't want to sacrifice the right to a pension. Part of the social pact that everybody expects in Latin America is universal access to pension, to education. You know, the principle of universality is there, and I think there's no country that says, oh no, I'm not going to have universal coverage. The thing is, you know, how do you finance that in an efficient system? And there are many trade-offs, as you said. Role of the state? Yeah, well, look, I think we've learned, the world has learned now, I mean, some people didn't need that lesson, but I mean, many did, particularly economists. You know, the financial crisis of 2009-8, or as Jose Antonio Ocampo calls it, the North Atlantic financial crisis, because it was really North Atlantic, taught those economies that had tremendous confidence in the non-regulated, that the best, you know, the wisest, the biggest wisdom was in the financial markets themselves to self-regulate. And there were theories, economic theories, justifying that, don't touch it. You know, if the state touches that, you break it. Well, it broke not because of the state touched it, but because it didn't touch it. And then financial sector came, and bankers and so on, for a huge series of rescue packages. done by the state. So that was a big humbling lesson for economists, that things are, have to be balanced, that the market has a lot of virtues, of course, and very efficient in many things, but that you have to have, there's a big question always about what is the institutional framework, what is the regulatory framework, what are the emergency interventions that the state could do. And the second big lesson, or moment of lesson, it was the pandemic. I remember William Buiter, one very distinguished economist, saying, because there was all this discussion about the role of the state and, social transfers and so on. The pandemic made the biggest jump in social transfers everywhere, in Europe, developed countries, and developing countries. So the title of the article by William Buiter was Pandemic Socialism. I mean, suddenly, this was just huge. Okay, I'm not saying, this is just a lesson in the sense that one has to think that, in this world of uncertainty, of shocks, unexpected, you have to have a lot of the resilience, but everybody has to be ready to have resilience. Families, household sector, private company, but also the state, because there are some types of reaction that only the state can really solve. That's one thought, but I think, the lesson now is that the pure model of markets with all the optimal conditions only exists in textbooks. Every market in reality is embedded in some institutional and regulatory framework and in a society. So the society has to discuss what are the choices, what is the border of the pure capitalism plus the state. On the other hand, I think we have also learned the lessons that the state by itself is not a solution. The state can be corrupt, can be ineffective, can be, can be terrible. But also you can have, if you see the experiences of successful countries, that to go back to this list of sectors and so on, that all these things are not going to happen spontaneously. They have to be oriented, directed. There has to be a sense of direction. In some cases, you have to have, the right incentives and the collective mechanisms to work. So this is a question really of what kind of public-private partnerships, what kind of institutional arrangements. So I think it's important to stay away from that ideological discussion about the market on the state as if they were alternatives. Well, they are not. That's the wrong framing of the question. The right framing is the institutions, the technical operation, what I said before, and the governance arrangements. And then different countries are going to take a little bit of different, there's no one size fits all. This is just some thoughts on the issue of the role of the state. And we are thinking, I'm very conscious that ECLAC was, famous in talking about the desarrollista state and having perhaps a big faith in the role of the state, and we still have the faith, but it's not just faith. You cannot have faith. You have to have very pragmatic, because many states now and institutions deteriorate, and they could be corrupt, and you can see how, it is important to have tax reforms in many Latin American countries, but then it is true that in that discussion, many people say, why am I going to pay more taxes? See all the corruption, see all the ineffective expenditures and so on. So, so talking about the productivity and the effectiveness and the quality of the services provided by state institutions, it is crucial. And the corruption, I think maybe it's very difficult.
Yeah, we're reaching the end of our time. I did promise one more question. I have one small one myself, but please address that if you could as quickly as possible. We'll do our last two, and then within 5 minutes we'll conclude.
No, look, corruption, we don't have systematically kind of research programs like on corruption, but there are institutions that have, major problems of governance and so on. I think it's very related now with organized crime and all of that. I think many countries have, we have observed, quality institutions that can deal with corruption cases and, take to justice those that have broken the law and have abused it, and several Latin American countries. I don't want to mention any names or examples, but there are instances. So I think that's what you need. You need rule of law, and you need non-corrupt and good judicial systems and good processes, and that is the way. Unfortunately, organized crime works around many of these things and make life very difficult. And certainly the trend is to increase corruption.
Cindy.
Thanks so much, Cindy Arnson. one of the things that you mentioned as a key opportunity, not just the doom and gloom about the situation that the region is in, involves the green energy transition. How do you prevent the lithium reserves of major Latin American countries from becoming just another example of the region exporting primary commodities? I mean, what is the real possibility that there will be things that are sort of higher on the value chain, investments in battery factories or something that will allow the countries that have lithium to not just continue as exporters of primary materials? You mentioned the case of the Chilean startup that had found ways to convert buses that run on diesel to EVs. But concretely, do Latin American countries other than Brazil actually have the market power to attract investments in things that are higher up in the food chain, if you will? Thanks.
And actually, my question is along the same lines, but it returns to the hub issue that we heard about earlier, which is to say it's not realistic for every country in the region that has these resources to develop the entire battery and electric vehicle value chain, but it is possible to consider the region as developing those value chains. And so returning to the question, recognizing the challenges of integration that you referenced earlier, is it possible to realize that vision through regional value chains?
Yes, thank you. Very important questions. Well, first of all, you have to see that those countries that have huge reserves of lithium and at least like 12 minerals that are, massively present in electric vehicles and batteries, there are few. I mean, for Central America, this is a non-conversation. But, I mean, basically Chile, 1, 2, 3, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil also has, Peru, that are, have very, very significant reserves. Now, those reserves give them market power, to begin with that. I mean, it's not the market power of the size of the market of the country, but it's the fact is that they have, if you have 40, 30, 20% of the world reserves, you have market power. You have that amount of reserves. So there is a strong negotiating position, in principle, that you can have. Now, there are different schemes that the countries have had. We understand the most open is like in Argentina, where there's concessions for private companies. Then the most closed, in a way, is Bolivia, who has like a state company that is the only one that can do the exploitation of minerals, or in particular lithium. And then you have an in-between case, which is Chile, that needs like 51%, with the recent law, and the rest could be private participation. That in terms of the schemes. And I think this is really ironic, because, I mean, the fact is that if all these resources are, exploited, used, extracted, there is going to be more reprimarization in these countries. I mean, I don't see how Chile, with all the reserves of minerals, even if Chile develops modern digital services, software industries, more agriculture, you invent new fruits to export to the world, whatever, that there is a way in which the proportion of minerals, from 10 years from now in Chile is not going to increase. Because just it's so massive, the demand, the numbers are growing. So I think we have to, in a way, rethink what reprimarization means. It's not necessarily all bad. I mean, it's just, if a country has that amount of resources, well, it's a great bonanza. Now, the question is, the other part that you said is, how do you add value? How do you make sure you just don't export the earth with the lithium without no processing at all? And that is it is possible, but it is tricky, because these are sophisticated technologies. It's not easy to have, kind of all the knowledge for batteries, and this is changing, and there's a big international race, where Tesla and the Chinese companies and so on. So part of it is if you manage to persuade some of these multinationals and companies that manage to, bring these processes. Like, I mean, Costa Rica is producing microchips not because Costa Ricans know how to do microchips. It's because we have Intel. So, I mean, if you manage to bring the Intels of batteries to Chile, then you are into it. But there is a lot of niches, you know, when you look at these things in a fine way, which has happened in Costa Rica, for instance, with medical devices. There was not a medical device thing. Now Costa Rica, again, is producing pacemakers and, you know, we have, you know, the medical devices, value chain devices, like 12 segments, and Costa Rica is now positioned almost in all of them. Mostly because the multinationals have come and so on, but there is the ecosystem of suppliers to the multinationals, which are around 45 multinationals, is 120 companies. And around 60 of them are Costa Rican companies. Very slow process and so on, so they occupy space. So it is possible. The same applies, you know, to batteries and so on. But you have to have productive development policies, industrial policies. You have to have, you know, a lot of thinking about, you know, where do you can really do partnerships with the multinationals, dominate the technologies, have the right skills, etc. And there will be a lot of surprises. You know, there's a lot of technological uncertainty about this because, I mean, there's several research projects with a lot of money inventing other ways of producing, you know, efficient batteries that depend on other, you know, materials and so on. So we will see. That is very interesting.
This has been absolutely spectacular. Please join me in thanking Jose Manuel. Thank you for those of you who are here today in person. Thank you for our online audience. This was terrific, and we'll, of course, be continuing to touch upon all of these themes in the days, weeks, and months to come. So thank you again.